Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, with the aid of regular guest and French army expert James Taub, we delve into your questions on France in World War I. What exactly is a French colonial unit? What did the French think of the chauchat machine gun? And what did the British soldier think of his French counterpart? We discuss all this and much more. Well, hello again, James. Welcome back to the show on a particularly special day because I'm going to out you on this episode and inform the viewers that it's actually your birthday and you're giving up part of your birthday day to actually record this episode with us, which I think is a sign of great dedication to the podcast.
Well, no place I'd rather be. Of course, what's a better way to start my, 7 a.m. day than waking up to talk about World War I? That's my idea of a birthday. So
you're dedicated to the cause, James. So we're very grateful to have you again because it is just you and I. Dan on his travels, so he's not available. But we've been building up to this episode for some weeks, which is a general discussion about the French army. And what's going to drive this discussion are questions that our listeners have shared with us. And James, I think it's testament to how interesting the series that you helmed with us has been for our listeners, but that we have such an overwhelming number of questions that have come in through comments on Spotify, through email, but above all else through the Dugout system. And the Dugout, for those of you who don't know, and I hope you do, is a side project, if you will. It's a forum for discussion for listeners of the show, a chance to show your support for the show, a chance for you to interact with myself, James, and Dan in a more informal environment. If you're not already a member, all the information about it is in the show notes. You can join for free, or you can choose to subscribe if you'd like to support the show a little more. But as part of the Dugout, we opened a thread for general questions on the French army in the First World War. And that's produced a number of really interesting questions, many of which also are echoed by comments on email and on Spotify and so on. So we're going to delve into them. We're going to try and get through as many as you've got the energy to get through, to be honest, James. And I know that you're so expert on these that you may find you've got more to say than we have time to record, but I'm excited to see what you make of it. So without further ado, our first question comes from Eric over on the Dugout. And Eric asks a question that has been repeated a number of times, actually, which is, I'm slightly confused as to what a French colonial unit is. Is it a unit raised in the colonies or a unit that is liable to serve in the colonies? And of course, James, the difference between what you might call British colonial troops and French colonial troops is quite interesting. So could you expand on this for us? What exactly is a French colonial unit in World War I?
yes, and this is one of those very confusing topics because you see people say this or use the term colonial in pretty incorrect ways to the point that it's entered the mainstream when talking about World War I. I think one of the prime examples of this is the Second Battle of Ypres and the first German gas attack on the 22nd of April, 1915. You see countless British, Canadian sources that have continued being published to this day talking about the assault on the French colonials and witnessing the Algerians of the French colonials falling back. To the French, those are not colonial troops. So while in the British sense of what a colonial soldier is, because they're not from the metropole, because they're not from France itself, British soldiers, Canadian soldiers will consider them to be colonial. But for the French, that unit is the 45th Division, the 45th Infantry Division. And it's composed of Zouaves and Tirailleurs, which are the native North African soldiers, while Zouaves are from the European population. You have to be a French citizen to serve in the Zouaves. So coming from Algeria, they are considered French subjects of the metropole. Algeria is a French department at this time. So to break it all down, the Metropolitan French Army, the regular French Army, consists of the everyday soldiers you would see in a French infantry regiment. In 1914, red pants-wearing, kepi-wearing soldiers recruited to do their 2 or 3 years of active duty service, and then the several years of reserve service. Those soldiers, unless war is declared, are not liable to leave France. War has to be declared by the government for them to step foot in Germany, for them to step foot in Belgium. They are the mass conscript French army, and that makes up the vast majority of French forces in the World War. As part of the Metropolitan Army, there is also the Army of Africa. They are the 19th Corps. They are part of the overall French army, but they're headquartered in Algeria, and they're comprised of the Zouaves, these tirailleurs. The cavalry units are either the Chasseurs d'Afrique or the Spahis for native cavalrymen. So these soldiers are all considered part of the Metropolitan Army, except their station is in the French department of Algeria. They are much more liable for active military service because they're going to be campaigning against various tribes in the Sahara. They're going to be taking part in the Moroccan campaign in the earlier part of the decade. And many Frenchmen born in France who want to make a professional career out of the military and see active service will volunteer to serve in one of these Army of Africa units. Again, North Africa is what we're really talking about, and specifically Algeria. You'll see some expansion to Tunisia and Morocco as the war continues. So that's the Metropolitan Army. When we use the term colonial, we have to understand that France's overseas colonies historically have been run by the Navy. So the troops that will be referred to as colonial infantry regiments are Marine infantry regiments. Now, what's even more confusing is in France, the Marines are part of the army. So while you'll see anchors, while you see these guys fight famously in August, it's a colonial corps that gets devastated in the Ardennes forest on the 22nd of August. These men are colonial, now known as Marine infantry regiments in the army, liable for service overseas. The colonial soldiers have somewhat of a different supply system. They have somewhat of a different uniform and doctrine. They're mainly recruiting out of coastal areas of France. Again, this attachment to the Navy when they were still part of the Navy in the 19th century. This goes all the way back to the Compagnie Franche de la Marine in the 18th century. If you go look at Canada before it falls to the British, it's occupied by French Marines. These soldiers are also liable to go and be on garrison duty in French Indochina. They're liable to be on garrison duty in Madagascar and actively campaign there. In support of them as part of the colonial army are the local units. They're also referred to as tirailleurs, just like the tirailleurs algériens, but then you add on where they are from. So the tirailleurs Senegalese are probably the most famous. They're from all of French West Africa, not just what we now consider Senegal, so that can include Mali, will include parts of Chad, and really most of the French-speaking countries in the west coast of Africa. You also have the tirailleurs Indochinois from French Indochina. You'll have Malagasy soldiers joining. You even have soldiers from French Polynesia. All of these come together to form the French Colonial Army. And when the war kicks off and the majority of the fighting ends up taking place on the soil of France itself, the Colonial Army is going to be deployed in France. Many of their troops leaving their normal station. There are units that are recalled from Indochina. There are units that are recalled from Madagascar. And they'll fight as your everyday infantry units on the Western Front, and of course they have their supporting artillery. When the tirailleurs Senegalese and Indochinois are deployed on the Western Front, they're in individual battalions. Unlike the tirailleurs Algériens, who have full regiments similar to any other French infantry regiments, the ideas behind race, the racism which is permeated throughout the French Empire at the time, says that these soldiers are not necessarily trusted to operate on their own. So wherever you see a Senegalese battalion in action, it's as an addition to a French colonial infantry unit. You see a lot of mixture of colonial soldiers among these overseas colonial soldiers from Senegal, from Vietnam, integrated into French colonial infantry regiments as supporting arms that are attached at a time when an attack is imminent, when they're going to launch an attack. And it's often seen that you see these guys in the front wave to soak up fire before the French colonial infantry units go over. They're almost completely staffed by colonial infantry officers white colonial infantry officers, as are their NCOs, primarily Frenchmen. And so it does divide the colonial army and the metropolitan army in a really awkward way, because it isn't a clear, well, they're from overseas, so they're colonial. And it causes a lot of confusion at the time for British, for American, for all sorts of Dominion, Commonwealth forces. So who are these guys actually? What comprises a French colonial? And it's really what sector of the French military you fall into. Are you joining a colonial infantry regiment? Are you joining a metropolitan infantry regiment? Algeria is always going to be this touching point, but at the time, they are considered French. They are considered metropolitan French soldiers. So hopefully in a very long, awkward way, that clears it up. When you hear the French using the term colonial, know that they are talking about either Frenchmen in a colonial unit that is from France but are Marines, or they're Senegalese, they're East Asian, they're Malagasy support units.
Interesting, and I can understand why this causes so much confusion in the British Army, because the British Army, interestingly enough, for most of the First World War, it will refer to Australians, Canadians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Newfoundlanders as colonials. Even though they're strictly speaking from dominions, that hasn't really entered the popular language in Britain. And confusingly, you wouldn't necessarily refer to the Indian Army, which of course fights on the Western Front in the Middle East, as colonial in British language. You would refer to it as the Indian Army. It's a distinct army. It's a unique feature of the British Empire that India has its own standing professional army in the First and Second World Wars. And so the terminology gets really confusing because it doesn't map properly onto British terminology. And of course, it completely befuddles both the British and the Americans as well, who don't have that kind of model. And I'm glad you mentioned about the mixed Pacific battalions from French Polynesia, because one of the most interesting experiences I had a few years ago, I was in a French cemetery. It's actually a 100 Days cemetery. And there was one of the headstones was decorated with these very colorful flags that I didn't recognize. And I went over and it turned out he was a casualty from the mixed Pacific battalion who'd been killed down on the Second Battle of the Marne, which is a reminder that's a very long way from home to fall. So really interesting. And I appreciate you absolutely grappling with this very complicated subject, James.
It's hard.
It's challenging to say the least. But
the last thing I'll add about it is, it just gets into cultural difference about colonialism. The British Army is liable to be deployed in India. They are liable to be, sent to Canada or Australia. They hadn't for quite some time since when the First World War is broken out, but understanding of the French Third Republic, the role of the everyday Frenchman in the overseas French Empire is drastically different to the average Briton.
Interesting point, and one that perhaps warrants its own episode. Different empires at war, very different, Britain and France. But from a big complex question of definitions and so forth, to a question which I know, James, because you've given it away a number of times, you've been burning to grapple with this question. And my challenge to you is to limit your answer to this question and not turn into a full episode.
Notes taken.
Because the question is from Joe Rooney over on the Dugout. And he says this. He says, the chauchat has gotten a lot of bad press in historic firearms circles. Part of that may be from American use of the weapon, especially when they had the BAR waiting in the wings, so to speak. But what did the French soldiers think of it? Straightforward question. And as somebody who felt the sort of sharp edge of the historic firearms community when I criticized the Ross rifle about 60 episodes ago, and I'm still smarting from that, I know the historic firearms community takes this very seriously, but it's an important question, James. What does the French army make of the chauchat?
Okay, I will say that I am not an extremist about anything in life. I try very hard to not flirt with extremism. I am an extremist for the chauchat. I imagine myself as one of its most ardent defenders. And yes, I do believe that the American experience with the chauchat has absolutely kind of tarnished its reputation. But I think it's really important to take ourselves out of the mindset of folks who know about what's going to happen when the Americans pick it up, know that automatic weapons will be developed further by the end of the war and then all the way through into the Second World War. So let's put ourselves in 1915 when the chauchat first is being rolled out. It's being made out of stamped metal in a bicycle factory. It is the first of its type. It is the first light machine gun that is meant for infantry assault usage. We like to think of just the word machine gun generally. You don't have to think of light. But imagine yourself with a Lewis gun, the German MGO 815. You think of these being used in prone positions, using to defend, maybe lay down suppressing fire for your other soldiers while they're advancing, and that is how those weapons will be used. The chauchat is meant to be fired in the advance. If you look at its design, it's got a handle at the front, and it is meant to be hip-fired while walking forward. Look at videos. Look them up on YouTube. Look it up in any French archives of French soldiers training with the chauchat. They're moving when they fire it. It is not a defensive weapon. It is not a weapon where the operator is meant to be stationary and just belting out fire to suppress the enemy. You could see how the BAR is actually influenced by the chauchat because that's how the BAR is meant to be operated as well. They don't end up doing that, and especially with its much more wider usage in the Second World War, you see it kind of as a, this squad automatic weapon as would be featured today. But original American designs in World War I for the BAR include the ammunition belt every soldier is wearing actually has a metal cup. So the soldier can rest the butt of the BAR into his hip as he's firing it and advancing. So the chauchat is a ad hoc, just off the cuff. What can we produce? We need our infantry to have more firepower, and we need to figure out how to develop firepower for infantry in the advance. You can't just completely rely on the ever-increasing numbers of Hotchkiss or Saint Etienne heavy machine guns that take a multiple person crew. How do we increase this infantry firepower? And just look at the citations that the fusiliers mitrailleuses get. That's the French term for their light machine gunners. The citations of just guys just standing up on the parapet, walking forward, firing from the hip. It plays out of an action movie. Yes, it is absolutely not the best light machine gun of all time. It is not the best light machine gun of the First World War. But it's the first. So are you ever going to say, hey, you know what? The Wright brothers plane was a piece of crap. Like it is, wow, the Apollo 11 mission, that capsule wasn't the best space capsule it's ever getting. Well, went to the moon. So it's, I will ardently defend the chauchat. I think a lot of weapons from the First World War end up getting a bad rep in the years that follow. But you have to put yourself in the time of the, these are all the first. Given where the lightness of argument we put on aircraft and aircraft design, think about how much that advanced over 4 years. It's the same with infantry firearms, not only in the French army, but across the board. That's my rant. Ardent defender of the chauchat.
I think you made the case very strongly, and I think an interesting thing about the chauchat's reputation, you really hit on that it's the first. And it's always going to have certain drawbacks. It doesn't have the benefit of a long lead time or a design time. And I'd add another thing to it, and that's that making a light machine gun in the First World War is hard. It's the first time it's ever been done. And for all the criticism the chauchat gets, which I think a lot of it seems to stem from British and especially American troops complaining about it. They don't like it. They don't perhaps fully understand its role tactically and things like this. Let's not forget that the Germans can't make a really effective light machine gun either. The MG 08/15 is okay. It's absolutely okay, but it's too heavy. It's at least 33 pounds in weight. And that's not including its ammunition and kit. German light machine gunners don't especially like it. They seem to prefer the Madsen, which is a Danish-made, Norwegian-made, I just lose track, light machine gun instead, which they import. In some ways, the two most successful light machine guns to come out of this are the Lewis gun, used by the British and other forces, and the BAR. But even they have their problems. It's interesting to read about Lewis guns in 1915 when they're first coming into service in the British Army. And a lot of people complain about them and go, well, they jam all the time, the barrel breaks, we don't like them, we don't know what to do with them. And then gradually people start to adopt them and use them in large numbers instead. So it's not easy to create and implement a light machine gun. And as you say, a lot of this stuff gets criticized after the war. It doesn't survive after the war, gets replaced. But I think your point that whenever you're innovating something, the early editions will look dated as technology improves is well worth remembering. So a good point there. Next question, and we do have a lot to get through. I'm already aware that we're probably not going to get all of these through here, but moving away a little bit from the military material, I think is This is a question that we had a lot, especially regarding our last episode about France in 1918. This one comes from the Dugout from Libby Monks. And this is about World War I in popular memory in France and its relationship with 1940. Now, I know you touched on this in our 1918 episode, but it's worth delving in a bit deeper here. And Libby Monks asks, I heard that Petain's appointment in 1940 was described as running back to the grandfather who protected you the first time around. Is that an accurate sentiment? Has the Petain link to Vichy sullied French feelings about World War I and Verdun? Were other key World War I figures involved in Vichy France? So a big question, James, but what can you tell us about this still, I think, quite controversial linkage to the Vichy regime?
Yeah, I think we should start with Petain. If you say his name in France today, the immediate association is Vichy, outside of a few select circles. So there is absolutely a sort of hesitancy looking at Petain and some of the other leaders of the First World War who end up siding with Vichy during the Second World War that tarnishes the reputation of the First World War. It also should be pointed out that, quite a few French veterans of the Great War are pretty far right in the 1930s, similar to veterans in Germany. The veteran community in France covers a wide array of the political spectrum, including the far right, including flirting with fascism. So that does, in a large part, sort of tarnish this reputation. There's also the current politics, which, of course, I'll stay well clear of, but a similar sort of sense of a defense of France is associated with Verdun that appeals to certain political parties. So it is a very, very touchy subject. Even, some of the songs from the First World War about defending France are very, very touchy. The fact of the matter is that, yes, a lot of French officers of the Second World War, both Vichy France and Free France, are veterans of World War I. You can't avoid that. And, Marc Bloch is the famous preeminent historian who serves in the First World War and is a member of the Resistance and is executed only a few days after D-Day. Is one example of someone involved in the Resistance or the Free French movement. The French army as a whole seems to, once it's disbanded after 1940 and then reformed as the Army of the Armistice until Operation Torch, Petain is that grandfather figure. Now, there's absolutely a sense that they should have kept fighting, and many in the French army feel a sense of betrayal that Petain had given up so quickly. But Petain's legacy is very, very damning and complicated, and it's hard not to be as a leader of a collaborationist government. There's also plenty of Petain defenders who are beginning to form their own organizations, and it, of course, also plays into modern politics. I think it's interesting to note that here in the United States, there are still streets named after Petain, and as a reference to his service in the First World War. So it will always be a very, very complicated moment. World War I definitely still has that lost generation aspect to it, similar to what it does in Britain. But the sheer level of destruction also plays a role in this view of France in the first half of the 20th century all together in one spot. Verdun is used now very heavily as the First World War memory is generally as a pro-European hotspot. You see throughout the second half of the 20th century moments of reconciliation between various leaders of France and Germany at the ossuary at Douaumont, Charles de Gaulle, among others. And so, and I think that is how many French organizations in the next few years and currently are pushing the history of the First World War is how horrible is this? We can't have another European war. But each person around the world will take their own lesson from Verdun, from the French experience of the First World War. And just like any other point in history in any other country, it's being used and being remembered depending on how people want to use and want to remember it.
And you made a great point in our 1918 episode about the complexity of French memory, certainly compared perhaps to the Anglophone memory of the First World War, which is complex in its own right and has its own ups and downs. But the collapse in 1940, still hangs over the whole French historical memory of this, and is one of those that's so difficult to disentangle. Even now, even as it begins to fade out of living memory, I think it colors that entire period. And in the English-speaking world, there's been, certainly in the 21st century, there's been a real effort to try and reposition the First World War as an extraordinarily costly and bloody and ideally avoided in the first place war, but also a war that ended, at least from a British perspective, with a victory. Britain achieves its goals, albeit at an astonishing cost. And then the Second World War, is a definitive moment of the British national psyche, still is, the spirit of 1940 and so on. And it's fascinating how the conflicts are seen differently because of what happens in 1940. And that actually brings on to next question, which is one I might actually field, because this comes from Stephen Fairbank, who is interested in British attitudes towards the French army. And he notes he's a long-time World War I living historian, and he's very interested in the French army. But what he's interested about is perceptions of the French army in the aftermath of sort of 1940, in what he describes as the Dunkirk collapse. And this is something I'd like to just field a little bit, because the British attitude towards the French really veers quite dramatically at various periods. And in the aftermath of the Entente Cordiale in 1904, there's a real effort to try and promote Anglo-French understanding and really lay to bed the long-running feud and long-running rivalry between Britain and France, which stretches back centuries, of course. And the Entente Cordiale is quite a radical departure from centuries of British and French policy. And trying to promote this culturally, it takes a lot of time and effort. Then you have the experience in the First World War where millions of British servicemen and indeed women actually experienced France. And unless you were relatively wealthy, that just was something that didn't happen in the 1900s. You were much more likely to go to the colonies than you were actually to go to continental Europe. Language barriers and so on were a discouragement, even though it's a lot easier to get to France than, say, to get to Canada or Australia. But this was the way that the British psyche worked. But it did mean that millions of soldiers encountered French culture, French civilians. Not quite so much French soldiers. You might see French soldiers, but actually the experience of fighting side by side with French soldiers, relatively rare and limited to relatively narrow periods of the war. Then in the aftermath of the First World War, an event occurred that really damaged the image of France and the French army in turn in Britain, and this was the Ruhr crisis in the early 1920s, where the French deployed troops into the Ruhr Valley to secure reparations that they argued the German government was avoiding paying them. And this is one of the triggers for the notorious German hyperinflation of 1923, which has a profound economic effects, profound political effects in Germany as well. And France's belligerent attitude towards Germany in the early 1920s, and particularly this incident, and just to add to the controversy of this incident, the French used black African troops as well to occupy this area, which at the time was politically a very, very provocative move, a very hot potato, and interestingly attracted a great deal of criticism in Britain from both the political right and the political left, that this should not be being done. And from that point on, attitudes you can start to see in writing sour a little bit, not completely, but there's definitely a sort of a change in the mood. And then through the 20s and 30s, when the so-called Battle of the Memoirs is raging through Britain, all these people are publishing books and accounts of what's gone on. There's a lot of generals and politicians in the 20s and 30s in Britain who like to blame the French and say, we'd have won it if the French we'd won it a lot cheaper if the French hadn't been so incompetent and so wasteful of their troops. The French weren't cooperative, the French were difficult, the French never gave us credit, and you see this a lot in British generals' memoirs in the 20s and 30s. And then through the 30s, of course, the attitude starts to change again as it becomes clear Britain and France are likely to face a serious threat in Germany, that the mood begins to change. It's interesting when The Great War, I Was There, which is an incredibly popular part work that starts getting published in the late 30s in Britain, there's a lot of stuff about the French army, and it's generally very positive. It leans a little bit into the exoticism of the French army, Algerian troops, West African troops, and so on, colourful uniforms. But it's trying to re-establish this image and try and rebuild this. And of course, when Britain and France go to war in 1939, side by side again, there's a big effort to recall the courage of the two armies. Forget about this falling out in the 20s and 30s. We're side by side again. And one of the great tragedies, actually, for the British Expeditionary Force in 39 and 40 is it is determined to work as closely with the French as possible. And Lord Gort, VC, he'd won his VC in the First World War. He's probably not the right man to command the British Army in 1939 and 40. That's perhaps a topic for our sister podcast. But he's absolutely determined. He wants to work as closely with the French as he can. And that means that ultimately he gets involved in the so-called Dial Plan, the advance into Belgium, which has sadly grim repercussions. And it also adds to this sense in the British Army that the French Army has evaporated around them in 1940 because the British are so keen to work with the French, and the French vice versa, incidentally. And then when it all falls apart in 1940, there's a lot of finger pointing. Who's to blame for this? The British blame the French blame the British, and the circle continues. So that's a story. We're getting into really a story for our sister podcast there, but it's quite tragic, actually, really, how the Anglo-French alliance, which had endured through 4 years of brutal First World War combat, is broken within a year in 1940, James.
Yeah, how quickly that turns around. And then, of course, you've got the still controversial moment at Mers el Kabir in 40, excuse me. But during the conflict of 1418 itself, it is the same interaction you have between British and American, between British and French. There's a lot of national pride. For the British soldier, of course, we need to launch an assault at the Somme to help the French out, who are desperately struggling. Likewise, for the French soldier in 1918, of course, the British are falling back in the face of the German spring offensives. We've got to go up and help them. So there from a bottom level up, there's always that somewhat friendly competition. And of course, we're the best soldiers. So how can we go about doing this? I think also the spick and span, the bright shining buttons of the French army are not all that impressive to the British soldiers, who say these guys are not professional trained soldiers, especially when you see the first units of the BEF arriving in 1914, and they're not. They're conscripts. So I think the British soldiers are constantly shocked at the appearance. The French trenches we hinted at throughout the podcast are never as good as British trenches or German trenches. But I think that the British soldiers also, frankly, unimpressed with France, as was the American soldier once they got outside of Paris. Several American soldiers talk about the competition between French farmers' manure heap piles was a common theme. So, it's very complicated.
A really interesting issue, and we did touch on it in our Life of a French Soldier episode. The visual of a French soldier to a British soldier is striking. The French always look untidy. They always seem to be carrying all sorts of bits of kit in strange ways. And compared to the British Army, which tried to pride itself on strict discipline and uniform discipline, they look shambolic. But of course, their fighting capacity is a different matter entirely. And that actually brings us on to another interesting question. And this is from Dugout member Lloyd George, hopefully not the actual Lloyd George, come back to curse all British generals, who asked a number of questions, all of which are extremely interesting. But one that I'd like to get your opinion on, James, is to do with French morale and the mutinies of 1917. And Lloyd George asks, at the end of 1916, with the successes at the Somme, certainly compared to the British, and having pushed the Germans back at Verdun, were there warning signs of what was to come in 1917 after the Nivelle offensive? Were officers or NCOs warning that the army was showing signs of fatigue after 3 years of heavy casualties?
I would say following the Somme and Verdun, not as much. French army morale is incredibly high in the winter of 1916, 1917 because they feel as though they've won at Verdun. They've held out. And there's a lot of confidence in the new commander, General Nivelle. And he's telling them, guys, this is going to be great. Come spring, we're going to kick their butts. That very quickly falls apart. And I think it's that cliff that French morale comes to during the actual Nivelle offensive that leads to what we would consider to be these mutinies. But it should be pointed out that there are other points in the war where the French army is scared about indiscipline. 1915 sees the highest number of executions in the French army, many of them for cowardice under fire, accused. The Corporals of Soulain is a very famous episode where a number of NCOs are executed. This is all in late 1914, early 1915. So there are points where you see that this might get out of hand. Now, there's also the question of, were these soldiers who were executed actually guilty of anything? Were they being picked out for poor performance by their unit in the eyes of their generals? So I think that the French army going into the spring offensives of 1917 did not expect what would eventually occur, but they did expect that there would be a huge victory. So if all of a sudden you're assaulting and you start to see the casualty figures and you start to see the lack of progress as promised, there's definitely progress, but not as large as the General Nivelle had promised. That's when the real problems are going to arise.
That's certainly, and I'm coming from a very Anglo-centric perspective, but that's certainly my understanding of the situation is not that the army is demoralized after this tremendous fighting through 16. It's actually, its motivation's high. There's a lot of material that's produced, postcards, posters, and so on, celebrating 1916 as a turning point, that this is the year the Germans have been really beaten up. They've taken a hammering at the Somme. They've taken a hammering at Verdun. They also know that the Russians have hammered them in the Brusilov offensive in Ukraine. All this is adding together. They know Germany is under strain, because Germany is under tremendous strain at the end of 1916, and there's a feeling that 1917 is going to be our year. I think, if anything, expectations rise dramatically through early 1917 because Nivelle is pumping everybody's tires, telling them that he's got the secret, and it's going to shatter the Western Front. And given that the mood is already, well, we've turned the tide. We know we've inflicted a lot of damage on the Germans. Here's a hero of Verdun who's part of that, who's now telling us he's got the secret. He's got the key to finally end this deadlock. And the signs that he might have, the French armored branch is starting to come, is about to come into action. And then on top of that, just before the offensive begins, the Americans enter the war as well. And there's British accounts about there's this wild celebrating through parts of France at the announcement the United States has joined the war, that France and America are much more closely culturally linked in 1917 than perhaps they are today. And there are, there's widespread cheering. People produce stars and stripes and fly them. And there's almost an expectation that the entire US Army, numbering millions, is about to arrive on French shores in a matter of hours. And they're really going to give the Germans what for. And so all this expectation is built up and built up and built up. This is going to be the moment. Of course, the British and British Empire Battle of Arad goes off just before the Nivelle offensive. That captures Vimy Ridge. It inflicts a huge blow on the Germans. All the expectations are so high, and then the French army runs into a brick wall and suffers very, very heavy casualties. And it's quite clear Nivelle doesn't have the secret, and instead it's a bloodbath, especially for the French army, an awful battle for them, a dreadful experience being in those Schneider tanks. You can understand, James, the psychological shock that, well, for months we've been told this is it, and then it's not it. We've been lied to, we've been thrown into just another battle like 1915.
Yeah, the repetition is absolutely a factor. And that this is why you see that the French army slowly but surely pull back on offensives as they wait for the takes from the Americans, as Petain says. But it should be noted that they still take part in offensives in 1917, multiple offensives, multiple successful offensives. But they're not these large-scale, wide-front slaughterhouses that you see at the Chemin des Dames or at the Somme or at Verdun. They are much smaller, and the ability for the French army to restore morale in itself and then endure through 1918, I think, is really, really interesting and understudied.
I would agree. I think if there's one thing that really strikes me about the French army through the First World War, it's incredible recuperative powers. 1914 and 1915, by all rights, should have shattered the French army. The sheer loss of territory, the sheer loss of manpower, and then it still fights on through 16, 17, despite its spasm of indiscipline, recovers, and then finds victory in 1918 as well. An amazing story. I'm going to combine two questions here because they link to each other. Andrew Koo has asked a number of interesting questions, but one in particular, and I'm going to combine this with another question. Andrew Koo asks, the French army were operating in various other theatres of war. How did they fare in those conflicts? And that combines with a question that Tom Golding Lee has asked, which is quite interesting. It's, with their homeland under such threat, why did the French commit relatively large forces to the Dardanelles and the Macedonian front? So, James, I wonder if we can perhaps take Tom's question to start with. Why do the French commit forces to the Dardanelles and Salonika? And then if we take Andrew's question, and how do they perform in these theatres?
So let's start with the Dardanelles. They go because the British are. They go because there's a fear. They do not want, if the Dardanelles campaign is successful, they do not want the British to be the sole power operating in the Eastern Mediterranean, especially with the idea that Russia may also expand southwards. The French, since the time of the Crusades, they say, have had an interest in the Eastern Mediterranean, and so they are constantly pushing to have some sort of French presence there, particularly in that area of like northern Syria, southern Turkey. Today, there's constant French interest. So when the British launched the Dardanelles campaign, the French are kind of taken by surprise when the British tell them they're going to go forward with it, but then they quickly gather forces together to be a part of it. Famously, the French Navy is very heavily active in the Mediterranean. That's where the majority of the French Navy is during the war. You see battleships sunk during the Dardanelles naval bombardment, naval campaign. There are more French soldiers than Australian soldiers at Gallipoli. But that is something that is often overlooked, and a lot of those soldiers do come from North Africa and the colonies. Then when it comes to the Salonika campaign, that is something that the Briand government is particularly interested in, to establish a supply route to the Serbians, which this is where the war starts. If Serbia is knocked out, that's the original war goal gone. They are scared that if the Serbians are defeated, that the Russians will find an excuse to no longer be in the war, because that is the primary reason to defend the fellow Slavs that Russia has entered the war. And it's also seen as an underbelly to the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Central Powers. So the French will continuously put more and more men into the Salonika front once the Dardanelles has closed up. They've seen it as kind of a relief that Gallipoli and the Dardanelles campaign has failed. It gives them an opportunity to open up what becomes the Salonika front. When the Serbian forces are evacuated to Corfu by the French Navy and the British Navy, they are quickly shifted back over to this new front that will tie up the Central Powers, Bulgaria having entered the war on their side, Romania having entered the war on the side of the Allies. It opens up just another thorn for the Germans to think about. But similarly to the British government, you have a lot of politicians, folks in high government who support extending the battlefront, making it so there's the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians and the Bulgarians have ever more to bite off. They always have to pay attention to multiple angles. The French High Command and the French leadership in the military understands that this war is going to be won on the Western Front. And so there's constant complaints about how much is being sent to Salonika, to other fronts. But the French government truly believes that for political reasons, for a French presence in the Eastern Mediterranean, for reasons of supporting their allies and preventing their allies from becoming more powerful than them, there always needs to be this French military presence. And you see French intervention in Greece through this when the Greek government doesn't go the way of the allies. And it should also be noted that there are French campaigns elsewhere in the world during the First World War. They are still actively campaigning in Tunisia, in Morocco. They are still actively campaigning in East Asia and in the Sahara. So there are other actions that the French army is undergoing, some of which take a pause for the war, but that doesn't mean that the enemy is in any way not shooting at them still.
Great points. And I think it serves as a reminder that for both Britain and France, this is not just a European war, it's also a war of empire. And the French and the British, you made a great point, James, are jockeying a little bit for position in a post-war world as well. This is a concern right from the very beginning of the First World War for Britain in particular, that, well, we don't want, whichever side wins, we don't want to be in a world where we're a lot weaker than the winner. And if Germany wins, that's disastrous for Britain. But if France wins really big, if France and Russia win really big and the British Empire is under threat, then perhaps 20 years after this war, it's going to be France and Russia against Britain. And one of Lord Kitchener's early strategic aims is, well, we want France and Russia to really bear the brunt of this war for a few years. Then we'll deploy our army and we'll be in a position to win the post-war world. And so there is this certain amount of jockeying around. One of the most obvious areas is the Middle East, where the British seriously think about making a naval landing at what is then Alexandretta in modern-day Syria. That makes a huge amount of military sense. That's the obvious route to go. A young T.E. Lawrence says that's where you've got to go. That's the strike point. That's going to break the Ottoman Empire in half. Lord Kitchener likes it. He sees it. And it's not implemented because the French say, Syria is one of our interests. And in fact, Britain and France had signed an agreement in 1912 saying Syria is a special area of interest to the French. And the French say, no way are you putting a British Empire army in the heart of Syria. It's just not going to happen. And Lawrence of Arabia and his interactions with the French in the Middle East is fascinating. If you read Lawrence, it's the Seven Pillars of Wisdom, epic book full of interesting things. The one thing he cannot stand is French military officers poking around in Arabia. And he does everything he can to try and keep the French out of there. He says they're going to mess everything up. And of course, the French are very interested in being there because they say, well, we don't want the British to just take over all of the Middle East. So there is inter-allied politics. Even though everyone's fighting for the same cause, everyone's also got one eye on the post-war world that, it's no use winning and then just 10 years from now having an Anglo-French war where one side or the other is going to get really, really beaten up. So really interesting complexities. You actually see similar complexities as well between Germany, Austro-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. They are all thinking about a post-war world as well, even though all three of their empires are going down in flames. It's fascinating. In 1918, the Ottomans are basically saying, we've lost Arabia. Doesn't matter. There's nothing interesting there. This is, of course, pre-discovery of massive oil fields. What we really want to do is expand in the Caucasus at the expense of the collapsing Russian Empire. And that makes perfect sense from an Ottoman Empire perspective, but it drives the Germans absolutely to despair. The Germans are saying, recapture the Mosul oil fields and retake Baghdad. And the Ottoman government's going, well, we're not really interested in that. We'd rather expand northwards and capture the Caucasus region instead. That's imperial visions in a European war. So it's complex. It probably deserves its own mini-series, the imperial strategies that go forward and back.
And I will say, I'm blanking on his name right now, but there is a French version of Lawrence of Arabia, and a book was recently published about him. It doesn't have the same prolific writing career after the war that T.E. Lawrence does. But yeah, they're there, and much to the British chagrin.
And also, the French gentleman probably doesn't have one of the all-time great movies made about his life either. Lawrence of Arabia, fantastic film, repays watching. And that's actually going to bring me on to the last question. We have so many more questions. I think we'll probably have to do a part 2 of this Q&A at some point. So many more questions we just couldn't get to. But a final question, it's actually from Stephen Fairbank again, but seems we've just hit on films, and I love films. I know you're a great film buff as well, James, of particularly war films. Stephen Fairbank asks, what are people's favourite French films about the Great War? And he lists his top 3 as The Wooden Crosses, Life and Nothing But, and The Very Long Engagement. So, James, I'm going to put you on the spot. What are your top 3 films dealing with the French experience of the First World War?
So, top 3 films dealing with the French experience. Wooden Crosses is up there. The Croix de Bois, based off of a memoir of a French soldier, or a novel written of a French soldier, very much the French version of All Quiet on the Western Front. That is absolutely up there. That is probably my favorite. So he stole my thunder a little bit. That is up there. There are several other French films that are more recent that I think take a very interesting look at various aspects of the First World War. I believe it was either the late 80s or early 90s, Captain Conan was a film that came out, and it is an action film. Do not watch this for historical accuracy, but it's a fun movie because it's about the French army at the tail end of World War I in the Macedonian front. And it follows soldiers who just want to go home. And then it becomes a murder mystery. And there's a little bit more about outside of and a romance. It becomes a little bit more than just World War I, but it follows the French army of occupation going into Bulgaria and then Romania, and just this weird different situation that you don't often hear about, but it exists and is an important aspect of the French experience at the tail end of World War I, especially for all these soldiers who are levied to fight the Germans and everyone else has gone home, and now they're stationed in the Balkans trying to figure out why they can't go home. Really, really interesting film as well. Of course, you can't not mention Paths of Glory. I mean, it's controversial, to say the least, banned in France for a time, but a intricate look, I think, at the mid-20th century understanding of the French army and of the French army mutinies during the First World War, not actually based on the 1917 events, but based on the events of 1915, but placed later in the war for the film. There's so much that could be written about that movie in memory. And I think, again, more than historical accuracy, in terms of memory and how memory has evolved, that film is incredibly important. You can't skip over it. Recently, in the 2014 as well, there was a miniseries done on Maurice Genevoix's memoirs. I think it's actually all available online for free now because it was produced by the French government for the 100th anniversary, in part. And it's French Band of Brothers, but set in 1914, 1915. And so definitely check that out, especially for that early war French experience.
I just have to echo your comment about the wooden crosses. And listeners, if you've not come across wooden crosses before, I believe you can probably get it through various streaming services. If you've not seen it, you're interested in war films, absolutely, you must watch this film. It was revolutionary at its time. Came out in 1933, so sound was just becoming more common in films. The sound design of this film is extremely advanced for its day, and the use of genuine ordnance sounds to try and really create an image. There's this wonderful use of soundscapes, a combination of natural sound, then this deafening ordnance with incidental music as well. And it's an explicitly anti-war film. It's ferociously anti-war. A great comparison to War Quiet on the Western Front. And it's set, of course, in 1914. It's actually set during the Great Retreat period of 1914. So it makes an interesting comparison piece. It's made in 1932, and it's about the horrors and miseries experienced by the French on the Great Retreat. Compare it to the smash hit British 1926 silent movie, Mons, which you can find on YouTube if you look it up. It's been rescored, I believe, by somebody told me it was a film student rescored it under the title The Vanished Army. And whereas the 1926 British film Mons has its hardships and its horrors, but it's basically a story of triumph and heroism and defiance. Wooden Crosses, which covers the same campaign from a French perspective, it's absolutely bleak. It's horrible. It's completely horrible. It's about the confusion and misery and pain of war. It's a hard-hitting, very, very modern film, and it's beautifully made. It's way ahead of its time in how it's made and it's constructed. And I've seen it described as one of the best World War I films you've never seen. So, listeners, if you piqued your interest, look it up. Wooden Crosses. It's not a pleasant watch. It's a very bleak film, but my goodness, it's powerful, James.
I would say it is my favorite World War I film because it is written by someone who's there. It covers 14 to probably 17, 18-ish. So you see a huge chunk of the war from the perspective of a French infantry squad, and just the language, the singing, the soundscapes, as you say, almost all of the background extras in this movie and some of the actors are World War I veterans. So that is their experience. How they're wearing their kit is how they wore their kit. They shot the film on battlefields in Champagne, and some of the pyrotechnics was actually setting off live ordnance still in the ground. And human remains were discovered on the battlefields as they're filming this movie. And I can't help the one scene that I always go back to and think to is there's a scene where they assault a village, and you just see this line of guys with bags of grenades just throwing grenades. And you're like, yep, nope, yeah. You don't see that in modern movies because it kind of looks ridiculous to the modern eye, but that's an assault in 1916. So I love that film. If you see one film about the French in World War I, it should be Wooden Crosses, the Croix de Bois.
Highly, highly recommended. And I think on that note, James, it's a great place to actually end this Q&A. We did not I think we managed to answer fewer than half the questions that we've been posed to us. So I'm sure we'll come back to round this, to continue this discussion, in fact. And listeners, if this has provoked your interest and you've got a question, do come and see us at the Dugout. There's a rolling thread of questions there that we can combine and pitch to James. And I'm sure we'll revisit this subject as we come back. But James, all that remains is thank you for your erudition and your insight into this fascinating topic. And thanks also for giving up your birthday morning for the listeners of Not So Quiet on the Western Front.
Yeah, there's no place I'd rather be, and there's no topic I'd rather be talking about this morning. So there we go. Set it off for a great day.
There we are. You heard it here, ladies and gentlemen. So thank you for listening in, and we'll see you again next week.
You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
Okay, well, there's going to be a few that I'm going to be like, hold on, let me Google this actual stat here.
Keep that out of the episode.
Yeah, that's... I got pinged for not knowing the effective range and rate of fire of a chauchat once, and I'm like, sorry guys.
I can believe it. The stories we could tell.